They thought he was already broken. His hands were bound. His helmet lay in the mud. Blood ran down his face, not enough to kill him, just enough to remind him how close death was. The German soldiers laughed. One of them leaned close and said something smug, something confident. That was when the American prisoner smiled back. Not a scream, not a plea, a smile. 45 seconds later, 21 men were dead and the forest was silent again. This is not a legend. This is not propaganda. This is a real World War II record. One buried for decades because it was too brutal, too fast, and too embarrassing for an entire unit of the German army. This is Dark War Records. The forest in Eastern Europe did not forgive mistakes. It swallowed sound. It hid bodies. It erased witnesses. In the winter of 1944, German patrols moved carefully through these woods, hunting for Allied paratroopers who had landed far off course. Most of those men were already dead, frozen, wounded, or captured. One of them was still alive. He had been running for hours, moving on instinct after his unit was shattered by anti-aircraft fire. No radio, no backup. Just a rifle he no longer carried and a sidearm he never used. When they found him, he was kneeling in the snow, surrounded, outnumbered, captured. The Germans were confident. They had rifles, submachine guns, numbers. He had none of that. They stripped him of weapons. They searched his boots. They mocked his accent. And they made one mistake. They left him standing. They didn't bind his legs. They didn't spread out properly. They didn't notice his breathing had slowed, not from fear, but calculation. He had been trained for this moment, not in a classroom, not in a manual, in silence, in blood, in repetition, until violence became faster than thought. One German officer stepped forward to interrogate him. Another soldier stood close, rifle slung casually, barrel pointing down. That rifle was loaded. The American noticed. The first movement was so fast it barely registered. A shoulder twist. A step forward. A hand on metal. The rifle was gone. The shot echoed once. Sharp, close, final. The officer fell before he understood what had happened. The forest exploded. The American did not aim like a soldier. He moved like a machine. He fired, dropped, turned, fired again. He used bodies as shields. He used panic as a weapon. The Germans fired wildly, hitting trees, snow, each other. 45 seconds is not long. But it is enough. Enough to empty magazines. Enough to close distance. Enough to kill men who hesitate. By the time the last echo died, 21 bodies lay scattered across the snow, some still clutching weapons they never raised. The Americans stood alone, breathing steady, hands shaking, not from fear, but from what came after. Silence. He didn't celebrate. He didn't shout. He ran because he knew something worse was coming, and because what he had just done would make him a priority target for the German army. What the Germans didn't know yet, but would soon, was that this was not the first time he had done something impossible. And it would not be the last. The war would remember him quietly. But the men who found the bodies would never forget. The Germans did not find the bodies immediately. Snow had begun to fall again, soft and steady, hiding footprints, muffling the smell of gunpowder. For nearly an hour, the forest pretended nothing had happened. Then, a patrol stumbled into the clearing. They stopped talking. 21 men lay dead in positions that made no sense. Some faced outward as if defending. Others were shot through the side or back. One still gripped a rifle with an empty magazine, finger frozen on the trigger. Another had been killed with his own weapon at point-blank range. This was not an ambush by a unit. This was something else. The officer in charge counted bodies twice, then a third time. He checked for shell casings. Too many for one man, yet all fired from German weapons. No Allied rounds. No grenades. No sign of a squad. Just chaos, compressed into less than a minute. A message was sent up the chain marked urgent. Then another, marked do not discuss. By nightfall, the clearing was surrounded. Dogs were brought in. Tracks were found. One set, moving fast, cutting uphill, vanishing near a frozen stream. The dogs lost the scent there. Someone said the American must be wounded. Someone else said no wounded man could do this. That night, orders changed. This was no longer a search. It was a hunt. The American kept moving, even when his legs started to fail. Adrenaline fades. Cold does not. His hands were blistered from the rifle. His shoulder screamed every time he shifted position. He hadn't eaten properly in 2 days. Still, he moved, because stopping meant death. He avoided roads. Avoided villages. Avoided anywhere a fire might be burning. At dawn, he reached a ridge and looked back. Smoke rose faintly in the distance. They were close. He understood something then, with a clarity that cut through exhaustion. If they caught him again, there would be no questions. German commanders argued over the report. Some said it was exaggerated. Some said it was sabotage by partisans. One officer said quietly that he had seen something like this before in Russia, when a single man wiped out a checkpoint and vanished into the night. That officer was told to keep his theories to himself. Still, the response was brutal. Roadblocks, random searches, villages questioned at gunpoint. They wanted a name. They never got one. What they did get were rumors. A farmer claimed he saw a ghost moving through the trees. A sentry swore someone whispered behind him, then disappeared. Another patrol reported shots fired, but found nothing when they advanced. Every report mentioned the same thing. No warning, no prolonged fight. Just sudden violence, then silence. Morale began to crack. Men started doubling watches. Some refused to separate from their units. A few fired into the woods at shadows. And the American watched it all from a hillside one night, wrapped in a stolen coat, counting their mistakes. 3 days later, he found what he needed. A supply truck, broken down on a narrow road. 2 guards. Tired. Cold. Arguing about cigarettes. He waited. He always waited. When it was over, the truck was empty, the guards gone, and the American had food, ammunition, and a map. The map told him something important. He was no longer behind enemy lines. He was deep inside them. And now, he had a choice. Run forever, or strike again. He folded the map carefully and started walking toward the nearest German staging area. Not because he wanted revenge, but because every unit chasing him was one less unit fighting somewhere else. Somewhere that mattered. The Germans would later describe the next encounters as impossible. Wrong angles. Unreal timing. A man who seemed to appear only when they were weakest. But the truth was simpler and far more terrifying. He was patient. He was trained. And he had already accepted that he might not survive the war. Men like that are the most dangerous of all. And the Germans were about to learn why. By the 4th night, fear had changed shape. It was no longer loud or panicked. It had become quiet. German units stopped singing. They stopped joking. Even the veterans, the ones who had survived Poland, France, Russia, spoke in short sentences and kept their rifles close. Because now they knew something worse than being attacked. They were being studied. The first staging area hit was supposed to be secure. 2 machine gun nests. Barbed wire. A command tent set back from the road. A perimeter wide enough to spot a platoon moving in daylight. No one expected a single man. The sentry never fired his rifle. He felt hands pull him backward, a blade press once, precise and silent. His body was lowered into the snow so gently that his helmet never fell. The second sentry noticed nothing, until his shadow suddenly wasn't alone. 3 seconds later, he was gone too. Inside the camp, men slept with boots still on. They were exhausted from chasing something they couldn't see. When the first gunshot cracked the air, it sounded like an accident. By the time they understood it was an attack, the machine gun nest on the east side was already silent. The American didn't stay. He never stayed. He struck the nerve. Command radios smashed, maps slashed, ammunition dumped into snow, then vanished before anyone could organize a response. By morning, the camp looked untouched, except for the dead. The report that reached headquarters was careful with its words. No mention of panic. No mention of confusion. Just facts. 3 killed. 2 wounded. Communications destroyed. Enemy strength unknown. That last line was underlined twice. The Germans changed tactics. They stopped sending patrols of 5 or 6. They moved in platoons. They laid traps. They left vehicles unattended, engines running. They staged fake camps. They placed wounded men where they could be heard calling for help. The American ignored all of it. He had learned the enemy too well. Instead, he attacked where they didn't expect violence, during supply transfers, at dawn, during moments of false safety. Once, he waited 7 hours in freezing rain just to kill a single officer stepping out of a tent, because officers mattered. Captured prisoners began talking. They said the man smiled when he was taken. They said he laughed when the ropes were tied. They said he looked relieved. At first, interrogators dismissed it as bravado. Later, they understood. He had already escaped once, and now, every man guarding him knew it. On the 6th day, the Germans finally cornered him. At least, they thought they did. A farmhouse. 1 road in. 1 road out. Tracks leading straight to the door. They surrounded it carefully. Weapons ready. A dozen men for 1 target. The door was kicked in. The house was empty. In the cellar, they found a blanket still warm. Outside, the first explosion went off. Not a bomb. Fuel dumped into the snow, ignited, sending smoke rolling across the field. Then, shots from behind. Then screams. The American didn't kill many that day. He didn't need to. He wanted them to run. By now, higher command was furious. This was no longer a battlefield problem, it was an insult. Orders came down to eliminate him at any cost, and that was when they made their biggest mistake. They sent elite men, men trained to hunt, to pursue, to outthink, men who believed they were better. The American learned this when he found their boot prints. Different pattern. Better spacing. No panic. He smiled for the first time in days, because this meant something important. They were afraid enough to send their best. That night, snow fell heavy. Visibility dropped to nothing. The forest swallowed sound. The elite unit moved carefully, methodically, exactly as trained. One by one, their radios stopped responding. Not destroyed, removed. By the time they realized what was happening, there were only 3 of them left, backs pressed together, breath steaming in the dark. They never fired a shot. The next morning, German command issued an order that would never be written down. If captured again, the American was not to be taken alive. Somewhere in the woods, the American felt the tone of the war shift. This was no longer survival. This was a reckoning. And it was only beginning. The forest no longer felt neutral. It leaned inward, branches sagging under snow, trunks packed tight like walls closing in. Sound died quickly here. Footsteps vanished. Screams didn't travel. Perfect ground for what was coming next. The German order spread quietly. No paperwork, no signatures, just words passed mouth to mouth. If you see him, kill him. If you capture him, don't bring him back. That told the American everything he needed to know. They were done pretending this was a hunt. Now it was an execution order. He learned it from a corpse. A German courier, frozen stiff beside a crushed bicycle, his dispatch case split open against a rock. Inside, maps marked in red pencil, search grids tightening like a noose. At the center, a single word written twice.
Zieltarget.
Below it, a sketch of a man with rough notes. Laughs when captured. Extremely calm. Prefers close range. Does not retreat unless wounded. The American closed the case slowly. They thought they understood him. They didn't. That night, he broke his own rule. He stayed. The village was small. 4 stone buildings, a burned-out church, a well-frozen solid. German troops had moved in only hours before, confident enough to light fires, confident enough to remove helmets. Confidence was always the beginning of the end. He watched them from the loft of a collapsed barn, counting breaths, memorizing patterns. 2 guards swapped every 15 minutes. One always paused to smoke. Another leaned his rifle against the wall instead of holding it. Human habits never changed. The first sound they heard wasn't a gunshot. It was silence. Too much of it. The radio operator reached for his headset and found nothing but a severed wire hanging loose. Before he could shout, something struck him hard in the throat. He never fell loudly. The officer tried to draw his pistol. It jammed. The American had packed the barrel with snow hours earlier. Panic spread fast now. Men fired into shadows. Orders contradicted each other. Someone screamed about a knife. Someone else about a ghost. By the time the firing stopped, 6 Germans were down. None of them had seen who attacked them. The American was already gone. 2 days later, they caught him again. This time for real. A slip on ice. A snapped branch. A dozen rifles snapping up at once. He didn't fight it. He dropped his weapon. Hands raised. Smiled. That smile broke something inside the men who saw it. They tied him fast. Hard knots. Rifle butts close. One soldier struck him across the ribs anyway, just to prove something to himself. The American didn't react. They marched him through the snow for hours. No questions. No interrogation. Just movement. At dusk, they stopped near a ravine. The officer in charge cleared his throat and read the order aloud, voice flat. Execution. Immediate. The American looked at the drop behind them, then at the men. Then he laughed. Not loud. Not mocking. Almost relieved. That was the moment the first guard made a mistake. He stepped too close. The American moved. What followed lasted less than a minute, but it felt longer to those who survived. Ropes came loose. A rifle hit the ground. A shot went wide, echoing uselessly into the trees. When it ended, the ravine was quiet again. 3 bodies lay still. The rest ran. By now, the story had outgrown reality. German troops whispered about a man who couldn't be held, who couldn't be killed, who chose when he was captured. Some said he wanted to die and couldn't. Others said he was already dead. Command didn't care anymore. They wanted him erased. The American knew his time was narrowing. Supplies low. Cold worsening. Enemy adapting. He needed something bigger, something final, something that would end the hunt. Ahead of him lay a choke point, an abandoned rail crossing where German reinforcements passed daily. He began to prepare, slowly, carefully, because this time, he wasn't escaping. This time, he was finishing it. The rail crossing looked harmless. 2 tracks. A signal post bent by shellfire. Snow filling the grooves where steel once screamed. German convoys passed here every morning. Men, supplies, prisoners. Routine breeds carelessness. Carelessness kills. The American arrived before dawn. He didn't rush. He never rushed. He studied the ground the way a hunter studies bone, where it breaks, where it holds, where pressure turns into collapse. He stripped branches and laid them across the snow to hide footprints. He packed snow into low berms to deflect sound. He dismantled a crate of grenades, taking pieces others wouldn't think to separate. This wasn't bravery. This was patience sharpened into a weapon. The first truck appeared just after sunrise. Engine coughing. Canvas sides stiff with ice. Laughter inside. Men who believed the forest was finished with them. The American waited. Second truck. Third. 21 men in total. He counted them without moving his lips. When the lead truck hit the crossing, he pulled once. Metal screamed. The signal post collapsed sideways, slamming into the truck's hood. The driver swerved too late. Tires lost traction. The vehicle jackknifed and rolled, blocking the tracks. Confusion exploded instantly. Men spilled out, shouting, slipping. Weapons tangled in slings. Someone fired into the trees, wild, blind. That was the second mistake. The first man went down without a sound. The American was close now, inside the chaos, not above it. He moved like smoke slipping between breaths. A knife appeared, disappeared. A rifle became a club. A grenade rolled under a truck and detonated low, tearing legs instead of engines. They never formed a line. They never aimed together. They never understood what was happening. 45 seconds felt like a lifetime. When it ended, snow was blackened. Steam rose from metal and bodies alike. Weapons lay scattered like dropped tools. The American stood alone, breathing steady, unhurt. 21 German soldiers lay dead around the crossing. He didn't celebrate. He left, because he knew what this meant. Within hours, German command stopped pretending this was coincidence. Units were pulled back. Officers summoned. The word berserker appeared in reports, then crossed out, replaced with unknown combatant. They didn't want myth. They wanted an explanation. They never got one. The American moved south, slower now. Every step hurt. Bruises deepened. A cut on his thigh refused to close. Sleep came in fragments, always ending in soundless memories. Faces, eyes. The laugh still echoed in his own head. 3 days later, Allied artillery thundered across the horizon. The front line was shifting. He had done enough. Too much, maybe? He collapsed in a snow-filled ditch as friendly patrols advanced, body giving up only when it knew it was safe. When they found him, they didn't recognize him at first. Just another frozen shape. Another almost dead man. In a field hospital days later, an officer tried to ask questions. The American stared at the ceiling, said nothing. When pressed, he finally spoke, just once. They stopped chasing. That was all. Official records would later list the incident as localized resistance activity. No names, no medals, no investigation. The war moved on, but the Germans never used that crossing again. Because sometimes, history isn't changed by armies. Sometimes it's changed by one man who refuses to die quietly and laughs when death thinks it has won. By the time the snow melted, the forest had forgotten his footsteps. War has a way of erasing evidence quickly. Shells churn the soil, new orders redraw maps, fresh bodies overwrite old ones. Whatever happened at that rail crossing was already dissolving into rumor by the time Allied units pushed deeper into the region. But rumors don't die easily. They mutate. German prisoners spoke in fragments, not testimonies, confessions. Some swore they'd seen him stand up after being shot. Others claimed he never fired first, only waited. One man insisted the American had looked disappointed when it ended. Officers dismissed it as shock. Privates didn't. They started refusing forest patrols at night. They requested transfers. Invented illnesses. Sabotaged their own equipment. Fear had slipped into the ranks, and fear spreads faster than orders. The American never learned any of this. He woke up weeks later in a hospital tent that smelled of disinfectant and burned coffee. His body was stitched, splinted, wrapped like something fragile pulled from wreckage. A medic told him he'd nearly frozen to death. Another said infection almost finished the job. Neither sounded impressed. They'd seen worse. An intelligence officer arrived on the third day. Young. Clean uniform. Eyes sharp with questions he wasn't sure he wanted answered. "You were reported missing," the officer said carefully. "Then dead. Then responsible for incidents." The American listened. Didn't deny. Didn't confirm. Just stared past him, eyes fixed on something far beyond the canvas walls. The officer closed his notebook. "Officially," he said, "none of it happened." The American nodded. That was exactly what he wanted. He was transferred quietly. No parade, no citation, no handshake photo. Just a new assignment far from the front, where paperwork mattered more than trigger pull. The war would end soon enough. Men like him weren't needed once it did. Years later, historians would stumble across inconsistencies. A patrol wiped out with no recorded engagement. A convoy never arriving with no ambush logged. A gap in German unit rosters that didn't match Allied action reports. They'd argue about numbers, about exaggeration, about myth-making. Most would move on. A few wouldn't. One of them found a note in a German archive decades later, written in pencil, smudged, never filed properly. It read, "If captured, do not mock him. If he laughs, you are already dead." No name followed, no signature, just a date, and a location scratched out twice, like someone wanted to forget where it happened. The American lived a long time after the war. Quiet life. Unremarkable job. No stories. When asked about the war, he always said the same thing. "I was lucky." People nodded. They always do. But sometimes, late at night, he would wake laughing. And somewhere, far across an ocean, in forests that grew thick over forgotten bones, the silence would feel heavier than it should. As if the war remembered him. Even if history didn't. Time did not soften what he had done. It buried it. The American learned quickly that silence was safer than truth. In the months after his recovery, he noticed how conversations stopped when he entered a room. How officers avoided his eyes. How orders were delivered through intermediaries, never face to face. They didn't fear him, they feared what acknowledging him would mean. Because if what he did was real, then the rules of war were thinner than anyone wanted to admit. The front collapsed faster than expected. German resistance fractured. Units surrendered in clusters. Others fought with the dull, mechanical obedience of men who knew the ending but hadn't been told to stop yet. The American watched it all from a distance. He wasn't allowed near combat zones anymore. Operational liability, the paperwork said. Translated, "We don't know what to do with you." One evening, in a requisition depot near the Rhine, he overheard two officers arguing in low voices. That incident in the forest never happened. I'm saying men talk. Let them. Stories don't win courts-martial. The American finished his coffee and left. He understood now. He had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, not legally, not morally. The war needed heroes who fit neatly into citations. It had no place for men who broke captivity with laughter and left 21 bodies cooling in the snow. Those men got erased. Yet the Germans hadn't erased him. Captured documents revealed something strange. Several units had updated their engagement protocols, not because of Allied strategy, but because of him. No isolated patrols, no prisoners taken alone. Immediate execution orders revised twice. His actions had forced a shift, not tactical, psychological. He had infected the enemy with doubt. In April 1945, as camps were liberated and cities fell, the American received his final assignment, guard duty, a former munitions warehouse. Converted holding area. Low risk, no attention, perfect. That night a German officer, young, shaking, barely holding himself together, recognized him. The recognition wasn't based on face. It was instinct. "You," the officer whispered in English. "You're the one." The American said nothing. The officer swallowed hard. "They told us not to mock you," he said. "They said if you laughed it meant..." He stopped. The American met his eyes. Didn't smile. Didn't laugh. Just watched. The officer backed away like a man stepping away from a loaded weapon. War ended weeks later. Celebrations erupted across Europe. Church bells. Gunfire in the air. Men hugging strangers. The American stood at the edge of it all. Unseen. Uncelebrated. Unrecorded. He felt no relief. Only emptiness. Because when the noise faded, he knew something others didn't yet understand. The war might be over, but the things it had pulled out of people, those never went back in. And somewhere in Germany, families would ask questions. What happened to our sons? Why wasn't there a battle? Why no grave? No answer would ever satisfy them, because the truth didn't fit into history books. The American packed his kit and prepared to leave Europe behind. He carried nothing with him from the forest. No souvenirs, no trophies, just the memory of how fast 45 seconds could change everything, and how laughter at the wrong moment could become a weapon sharper than steel. The ship that carried him home cut through gray water under a gray sky. Victory banners hung from the rails, already fraying in the wind. Men laughed loudly on deck, talking about home, about women, about food that wasn't canned or cold. The American stayed below. He had learned that crowds were loud enough to drown out memory, but quiet places made it speak. On the voyage back, A chaplain sat beside him once. Didn't ask about kills. Didn't ask about medals. Only asked one question. Do you regret it? The American thought for a long time. Regret means I had another option, he finally said. The chaplain didn't press further. Some answers, closed doors you can't reopen. Back home, the world had moved on faster than he expected. Factories retooled. Streets filled. Newspapers ran stories about heroes with clean smiles and simple arcs. His name wasn't in them. That was intentional. A debriefing officer explained it gently. Some actions, the officer said, are necessary, but unsuitable for public memory. The American nodded. He had already buried himself once. He could do it again. Years passed. He worked with his hands. Quiet jobs where repetition replaced thought. He married. He didn't talk much. His wife learned early not to ask about the war. At night, though, he sometimes sat up suddenly, heart hammering, breath shallow. Not from nightmares. From silence, because silence was what came just before everything went wrong. Across the ocean, the aftermath unfolded differently. German veterans' accounts began surfacing in the 1950s. Interviews, memoirs, therapy sessions never meant for publication. One story appeared again and again. Always vague. Always fearful. A captured American who laughed. A moment of certainty. Then chaos. Psychologists called it collective stress hallucination. Historians called it unverifiable, but the men who told it never laughed while remembering. One account ended with a line scribbled in the margin. We were trained to fear tanks. We were trained to fear aircraft. No one trained us to fear one man. The page was never published. The American grew old. His hands stiffened. His hearing faded. His laughter, rare as it was, became quieter, more brittle. One winter evening, a knock came at his door. A young man stood outside, holding a notebook. I'm researching the war, the man said. Someone told me you might know about an incident. The American studied him, saw curiosity. Ambition. The hunger for a story. He shook his head. You're looking in the wrong place, he said. The door closed gently. Because some truths don't deserve an audience. They don't inspire. They don't warn. They only explain how thin the line is between survival and something else entirely. And if you listen carefully, to the right silence, you can still hear it. Not gunfire, not screams, just a laugh. Brief. Controlled. And close enough to mean it's already too late. The silence followed him into old age. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It simply waited. The American stopped working after his hands finally betrayed him. Arthritis twisted his fingers into shapes that reminded him of cold mornings gripping frozen steel. He spent most days sitting by a window, watching seasons change like pages turning without meaning. Sometimes children passed by outside. They laughed easily. It startled him every time. Because laughter, real laughter, was something he had learned to associate with endings. He tried once to write it down. Just once. A notebook. Blank pages. A pen that shook slightly in his grip. He wrote the date of the capture, then stopped, because dates demanded explanations. Explanations demanded judgments, and he had no interest in either. The notebook went into a drawer and stayed there. In Germany, something unexpected happened. A military archive was quietly declassified. Nothing sensational, no headlines, just old files made public for researchers who still cared. Buried among logistics reports and casualty lists was a thin folder marked anomalous losses. Inside were after-action reports that didn't match, timelines that contradicted witnesses, casualty numbers with no corresponding engagement, repeated references to panic without cause. One report ended with a sentence that had been underlined twice. Enemy presence confirmed, though no unit identified. No officer had signed it. No explanation followed. A historian noticed the pattern. Forests. Rail crossings. Night. Always the same. He presented his findings at a small conference. Most dismissed it. One elderly German man in the back row didn't. Afterward, he approached the historian slowly, leaning on a cane. I was there, he said. The historian waited. We captured him, the man continued. And then we didn't. Back in America, the American fell ill. Hospitals felt too familiar. White sheets, measured voices, the constant sense of being observed. He refused painkillers, unless absolutely necessary. Clarity mattered. A nurse once asked him if he wanted a chaplain. He shook his head. Then, after a pause, said, I already spoke to God. He didn't argue. The nurse didn't know what to say. On his last night, he didn't sleep. He stared at the ceiling the same way he had stared at tent canvas decades earlier, waiting. Not for forgiveness, not for recognition, just for the moment when memory would finally stop knocking. Across the ocean, the historian published his work quietly. No sensational title, No accusations, just questions. The academic community debated it briefly, then moved on. But the comments, anonymous, unverified, told a different story. One simply read, "You found him." The American's breathing slowed, his eyes closed, and for the first time since the forest he smiled, not because he remembered, but because he didn't have to anymore. History recorded his death as unremarkable. No mention of forests, no rail crossings, no 45 seconds, just a name. A date, a blank space where the truth should have been. But war remembers its own, and sometimes it keeps secrets not to protect the innocent, but to contain what happens when one man decides fear works better than mercy. There was no ceremony, no folded flag handed to trembling hands, no gun salute cracking the sky. The American was buried quietly, like a man who had lived quietly. That was the final lie. Years later, the historian stood alone at the edge of a forest in Germany. The location matched too many reports to ignore. Rail lines nearby, old embankments half swallowed by moss. The trees stood close together, as if they had leaned inward over time to keep something hidden. He felt foolish standing there, until he didn't, because the forest was wrong, too quiet. No birds, no wind, no movement, just the weight of waiting. He found it near a rusted rail spike, a shallow depression in the ground, long filled in by snowmelt and leaves. Not a grave, not a trench, a place where bodies had once been, 21 of them. Gone now, but the earth remembered. Back home, the historian never finished the book. The manuscript ended mid-sentence. Friends said he became withdrawn, distracted, that he stopped attending conferences, that he once laughed softly during a lecture on military ethics, then apologized and left the room. He never explained why. War historians often say combat is about numbers, casualties, divisions, time. They are wrong. Sometimes war comes down to one man refusing to behave as expected. Refusing fear, refusing panic, refusing to beg. Sometimes, war changes because someone laughs at the exact moment he's supposed to break. German training manuals were updated after the war. Not publicly, not officially, but buried in tactical psychology sections was a line added in pencil, then typed in later editions. If an enemy shows calm amusement under capture, reassess immediately. No source given, no explanation. The American never knew this. He never knew that his 45 seconds became a warning passed down through generations of soldiers who would never hear his name. He never knew he altered how fear itself was understood. And that was fine, because he had never done it to be remembered. He had done it to survive, to end the hunt, to make sure they never laughed again. History will tell you this story didn't happen, that no man could kill 21 trained soldiers in under a minute. That fear exaggerates. That trauma invents monsters. History prefers clean edges. Reality does not. Because somewhere, in forgotten archives and half-whispered confessions, one truth remains untouched. They captured him. He laughed. And in 45 seconds, everything they believed about control, power, and mercy collapsed into the snow. This wasn't a story about heroism. It wasn't a story about justice. It was a story about what war forces out of people, and what happens when it does. If this made you uncomfortable, it did its job. Because real war history isn't meant to inspire comfort. It's meant to be remembered honestly.